We're just a bunch of pretentious, furless apes trying to figure things out on this mostly water-covered rock floating in space. First off, I should point out that whatever I'm about to say is not directed at any particular style, school, individual, whatever. Let's talk about swordsmanship and historical martial arts in general. Some of this also applies to contemporary martial arts. In particular... No, seriously. Stop feeling called out, Kevin. If any HEMA YouTuber's name actually happens to be Kevin, I'm gonna be in so much trouble. Jumping to conclusions is like the internet's Olympic discipline. Alright then. So, sparring, in my opinion, is an essential tool in the toolkit. But, let me start out by saying, if you do HEMA and you don't want to spar, you don't have to. Right? You're not going to be drafted by the HEMA army to fight the Persians at Thermopylae. If you don't spar, I think you're missing a piece of the puzzle in acquiring this skill, if that's what you're looking for. And not everybody who does HEMA is really primarily about acquiring the skill. Not everybody wants to be a competitor, shall we say. Some people just do it for the fun. I mean, it's fun exercise with swords. How could you not like it? There's that aspect, there's a community aspect, and everybody has different goal and different mindset going into it. Some people are very serious about it and want to do whatever they can to develop swordsmanship as the highest possible skill that they can. We're pretty disconnected from the historical reality of sword fighting back then. Yes, if you diligently study the manuscripts and you practice several different interpretations, you try to find out which interpretation works best. I mean, there's the first hurdle. You're dealing with interpretations. We can't talk to Fiore or Meyer or Lichtenauer. We can't personally listen to George Silver rant about what a terrible weapon the Italian rapier is. Fencing masters back then didn't all agree. Not by any means. And then the next hurdle is safety, of course. We don't want to injure or maim or end our training partners. The way we score hits is an abstraction from the reality of sword fighting because in some cases you don't know. Like if you take a light hit in unarmored combat, would that be enough to stop you? Would that prevent you from retaliating? Probably not, but maybe. There's so many question marks and uncertainties. Now, I do think it's possible to obtain what you might call mastery in HEMA, or rather in a specific, I almost said discipline, but that sounds too Olympic, tradition, shall we say, with a particular weapon. Some people have practiced for decades and have achieved an extremely high level of proficiency that I very much respect. And yeah, you can absolutely call that mastery. Does that make you a sword master? I think it's good to be aware of the space that is between historical swordsmanship and HEMA. The goal, of course, quite often is to make the gap as small as possible. But you can never get rid of it. There's always going to be a gap. There's always going to be a difference between learning from a master back in the 15th century or 16th century and applying the skill for real, which, afterwards you may not have another chance to apply it again, and practicing this recreation of those martial arts. And that's not just a matter of manuscripts versus living tradition, by the way, because things change. Even in what you call a living tradition, there are changes over time. As the martial lineage goes on over centuries, small changes here and there will accumulate and just change the nature of the thing. Anyway, so restrictions and considerations of authenticity aside, sparring, I think, is a pretty important piece of the puzzle either way. Again, not mandatory. It also doesn't mean that if you don't spar, there's no way you can know anything about martial arts. But you might end up down the wrong path, so to speak, if you don't pressure test what you practice. Now, sparring, in my opinion, should be the smaller part. The bulk of what you do should be understand the technique and then keep practicing over and over again so you're able to perform it. When I started all the way back in the early 2010s and even before, We did a lot of sparring, basically almost exclusively sparring. So it's the opposite extreme, which is bad. Of course, there's value in learning by doing, and you can figure certain things out, but it's going to be slower and you're much more likely to develop bad habits that then eventually you may have to unlearn to do the technique properly. Because certain things, for example, plenty of binding and winding techniques are not obvious. You're not really going to get to that through intuition for the most part. So it's going to be pretty limited if you do nothing but sparring without learning the technique. Again, if you do it for the fun exercise and acknowledge that you're not practicing a particular system or tradition or what have you, that's fine. Nothing wrong with that. You can absolutely do that. But if you want to learn from the historical manuscripts, of course, first you need a working interpretation. Hopefully one that's already been tested, that's well established. If not, then you have to go through the process of testing different interpretations against one another, see how well does this work, how well does that work, what if we change this, etc., like an experimental approach. And of course, a lot of the testing is done in sparring, not exclusively, because your training partner can give you some resistance when you're trying out techniques. You can absolutely do that in drills or in slow work or whatever. There are many different modes of practice, if you will. Those all come together to build the blocks that make up the skill, right? The main value of sparring lies in trying to apply techniques that your opponent doesn't want you to do, right? So you're trying to pull something off, they're trying to pull something off and counter what you're doing. And there's still limitations, of course. Particularly if you, let's say you only ever practice with a few people or maybe even just one person, because sometimes in your area you may just not have enough people who are interested in doing that. And eventually you kind of adapt to what the other person is doing, and like you develop a certain dynamic in sparring, and you know each other, you know each other's tactics and tricks and whatnot. Then if you fight somebody else, it might go quite differently. And I find the interplay between different people quite fascinating. I've seen it sometimes in sparring where person A consistently beats person B, and then person C comes along and consistently beats person A. So then you think, all right, so the skill ranking is C is the best, A second, and B is the worst, right? But then it turns out that B consistently beats C. Consistently is already an oversimplification, because even with a significant skill gap, it's pretty rare in my experience that one person always beats another, like always wipes the floor with them. If the skill gap is big enough, sure, but often it's, something like they win 80% of the time, but lose 20%, or, 70-30 or whatever. And here's the interesting part when it comes to a real historical duel. Imagine you have these two people, right? So A wins 80% of the time and B wins 20% of the time. What happens if in a real duel to the death or to first blood or whatever, there's only one attempt, right? There's only one round. So the 20% chance means that the person who is worse, less skilled than the other on average, could still win, right? Could still win the first round. But in sparring or friendly competition in general, which of course they did in history as well, as you keep fighting and you figure each other out, the dynamics may shift. Then, one person may start to win more often, or the two may start to become more equal, things like that. So it's pretty complex. And to the outside observer, none of that is obvious. If you just see two people spar or compete in a tournament or whatever, you see the results and you're like, yeah, that person's better than that person. Maybe, or maybe the other person had a bad day, or maybe that person's style is not compatible with the other style. Even if you practice the same tradition, people definitely develop their own styles, their own interpretations, their own tactics. Like even if you have identical inventories of skills, if you will, techniques, I should say, then one person might use that inventory a little bit differently than the other. So I guess what I'm trying to say is sparring is not only useful, but also fun because of all these dynamics. There's a lot to be learned. The more different people you spar with, the better. The more you learn. Sparring has its limitations, like any form of practice, really. And it also has its risks, like injury risks, which is particularly high in tournaments on average. And I can tell you, after having accumulated a bunch of injuries, although ironically most of them not during HEMA practice, it gets a little bit more challenging over time, especially as you enter middle age. Everything is a little bit more difficult to maintain to prevent yourself from falling apart. That's the important part. Never give up, never surrender. You can surrender in the grave. Sparring also shows you what you need to work on more, especially if you record it and review the recording to see, like, wait, what the hell am I doing with my foot? Why is my knee collapsing there? What's going on here? And then that helps you practice more in drills and whatnot to try to address the weak areas. And it can expose techniques that only work against a compliant partner and fall apart when met with resistance. So, useful tool. Anyway, to end on a final note, I wish there was less tribalism and infighting in HEMA and martial arts in general, and quite frankly, humanity in general. There's so much bickering. I've seen plenty of it, where people fight over different interpretations and they attack each other personally, and there's a lot of ego involved, and people can't take criticism or they're overly critical. I would like to say, hey, can't we just get along as fellow geeks? But no, because some people don't even like that term. Some people are like, no, actually, I identify as a nerd. Or others are like, no, what are you talking about? You may be a nerd or a geek. I'm not. I'm a normie. Sword fighting nowadays is not exactly serious business. If you want serious combat, join the military, right? That's how I look at it. I think we're doing ourselves a disservice by taking ourselves overly seriously and making ourselves look even weirder to normies. I mean, like, as if this isn't weird enough. Somebody who's not into this would look at that wall and be like,
are you some kind of serial killer? You're a weirdo.
I'm like, yeah, so what? Everybody's weird in some kind of way. We're just a bunch of pretentious, furless apes trying to figure things out on this mostly water-covered rock floating in space. Hey, it's not a big deal. I mean, it kind of is, but anyway, I've rambled enough. Thanks for watching if you made it this far, and take care.